So, last time I talked a little bit about what it meant for things to be considered alive. Right? What does it mean to be a living thing? This time, we're going to talk about what living things are made out of. And so there's only a limited amount of chemicals, elements, and molecules that are included in our repertoire of organic substances. So all living things are made out of the same basic building blocks. And the types of building blocks and what those building blocks are made out of comes from a very small list. So there's a few elements that we need to talk about. We're going to explore their properties. And then there are what's called macromolecules. And these macromolecules are the building blocks of all living things. And so we all come from the same stuff, whether we're yay high or so tiny bacteria, all made of the same stuff. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, the elements that make up each of these macromolecules are these 6 elements. And there's this acronym Chumps to remember it by. The C stands for carbon, the H is hydrogen, the O is oxygen, the N is nitrogen, the P is phosphorus, and the S is sulfur. And so we find these elements in all living things in varying degrees. And so the amount that you find these elements within living things as a total percentage of the whole is in decreasing order within this acronym. So living things are made primarily out of carbon. All of our macromolecules have carbon. And so carbon is the base of life. The next most abundant element that we see in living creatures is hydrogen, followed by oxygen, and then we see a sharp decrease into nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So C, H, and O are found in all of these macromolecules, whereas N, P, and S are only found in some of these macromolecules. And I'll go into which is which in the following sections. So, the first element I'm going to delve into is carbon, the base of all life. And the reason why it's so abundant in all of these macromolecules is that its structure lends itself to serving as a sort of base or foundation from which we can build off of. So carbon has 6 protons. Right? A neutral carbon will also have 6 electrons. And when it is bonding with other elements, it is looking to fill its valence shell with 4 more electrons. And so the way that carbon bonds with other elements makes it a very stable, very equally distributed energy-wise molecule. And carbon can link with other carbons, and carbon can link with any of these other elements. And so the properties of carbon allow it to serve as a building block, a foundational piece to all of these things. And so when we look into these structures, you'll see that the main skeleton of all of these things is based in carbon. So carbon's super important because it's a foundation. So here we are again, and I am now going to give you a brief introduction to hydrogen. Hydrogen. Okay. The most important thing about hydrogen is its size, because it's really, 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 really small. Okay. It's the smallest of all elements. hydrogen's atomic number is 1 because it only has 1 proton. The whole thing is just 1 proton. Right? So that's the smallest you can be and still be an element. Now, a neutral hydrogen has 1 electron, but it can lose that electron, and then that hydrogen is effectively just a proton. And so when we look at things like water, the properties of hydrogen become a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more interesting. But as an overarching idea, the function of hydrogen is to fill in any empty gaps in the bonding of these structures. So you have a carbon, it's looking for 4 bonds, right? And maybe it has a carbon here and a carbon here and oxygen here. It's looking for this last bond to be filled. We can just shove a hydrogen in there and fill up that gap. Right? That hydrogen is only looking for 1 bond, and so it's kind of like a cap. So you stick it on, it's done. Cool? So that's hydrogen's primary function in the majority of these things. There are interesting things like hydrogen bonding going on, and hydrogen as a proton does serve functions in a lot of our mechanisms, right? But that's not really the same storyline as macromolecules. And so we'll cover hydrogen movement when we look at things like nerve cells and photosynthesis. So, onwards and upwards, we are now going to discuss oxygen, oxygen on the board, oxygen in my hand, and oxygen's atomic number is 8, meaning it's made up of 8 protons. A neutral oxygen, therefore, has 8 electrons, meaning it's looking for 2 bonds in general. So this is a versatile element. Sometimes it's the cap on the end of a structure because it can just make a double bond with whatever it's attached to, and then you just have an oxygen chilling out. It can be a mediary thing, right? So it can be here attached to a carbon and an oxygen or a hydrogen. And so it can be a bridge or it can be a cap. But most importantly, the number one interesting property of oxygen is what's called electronegativity. And so the structure of oxygen makes it have a strong pull of electrons from other elements, right? So the electrons of the elements around it are attracted to the nucleus of the oxygen. The size of the oxygen lends itself well to this because the nucleus is sufficiently big enough to have a pull. Right? It's not this tiny little thing like a hydrogen. But the amount of electrons that it has is sufficiently small that that cloud doesn't interfere with that nucleus's pull towards it. And so when you have oxygens on the ends of any of these macromolecules, it gives a little bit of negativity to that end. Okay. And so instead of having these nice evenly charged molecules, all even all the way across, the oxygen side will have a little bit of a negative charge, and the non-oxygen side will have a little bit of a positive charge. This is a property called polarity, when one side of the molecule has a slightly, tiny little bit different charge than the other side. So this side ain't all negative and this side all positive, just the electrons tend to hang out over here more often than not. So this side's a little bit negative, and this side's a little bit positive in what's called dipole moments. And so that's oxygen's most important role in living things, is its property of electronegativity, its ability to pull electrons towards it to make its area more negative. So, those 3 elements that I just talked about, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, are found in all of these molecules. Moving down the list into nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, we start finding that they are not found in all of these. They are found in only a couple. And so when we are looking at nitrogen specifically, nitrogen is a major component of nucleic acids and proteins. It is not found in lipids or carbohydrates. So nitrogen atomic number is 7. Nitrogen is performing a similar role to carbon in that it's a foundational piece. One of the cool things about nitrogen is that depending on its circumstances, it can form a different amount of bonds. And so you can stress it out and add energy to it and make it add an extra bond if you really need to. But just in general, nitrogen is a base for what's an important thing in DNA, RNA, and ATP of nucleic acids. And in proteins, it's a huge important part in linking together the smaller components. So nitrogen is forming bridges for proteins and nucleic acids. So next up is phosphorus. And phosphorus is the biggest guy that we've talked about yet. Phosphorus' atomic number is 15, meaning it has 15 protons. A neutral phosphorus has 15 electrons. And so now we've got ourselves a bigger electron cloud. Not the hugest electron cloud, but a bigger one. So this doesn't have properties like oxygen, right? It's not forming the useful foundational bonds like nitrogen or carbon is. Its bonds can have a higher energy level, which is very useful when we look at a specific role that phosphorus plays, and that's in the story of ATP and ADP, adenosine triphosphate, adenosine diphosphate, which is a story of energy movement and manipulation within living organisms. We will explore in depth the importance of ATP many times throughout this course. ATP is very, 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 very important for living things. It's what our cells use for energy when they're doing cellular work. Okay. Outside of ATP and ADP, the phosphorus also plays a very important structural role in our DNA, in our RNA. And so our DNA and RNA are made of these long chains. And one of the components of those chains is the phosphorus. It's called a carbon phosphorus backbone. Nope, it's called sugar phosphate backbone, not a carbon phosphate backbone. Idiot Derek. Sugar phosphate backbone. Right. And when we look at these structures of nucleic acids, I'll show you more in depth how that works. But yeah, phosphorus, big guy, only found in nucleic acids and proteins, not lipids or carbohydrates. And finally, last and least, is sulfur. Okay. Sulfur is only found in proteins. It's not even found in the whole structure of the protein. It's only part of some amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. They do play a rather significant role where they are found. They form what are called disulfide bridges, which help our proteins maintain the shape that they have. Right? And so you get these little connections, and they're like big snakes, and they got connections as if the snake was here and the snake is stuck. Again, something we'll look at when we look more in depth at proteins, which will be during our transcription and translation unit, which is quite a bit down the line. Right? So we're not going to worry about the details of that quite yet. We'll worry about that later. Yeah. Sulfur is the biggest of these elements. Okay. Its atomic number is 16, meaning it has 16 protons. Neutral, it has 16 electrons. And its major role in all of this is forming disulfide bridges in the proteins. Cool. So that's all of the elements. Right? Cool. Now I'm going to talk about these 4 things, and that'll be it. So, first I have to give a little bit of an introduction to the nature of these macromolecules before I start talking about the details of each. So these macromolecules are what are called polymers. Okay? Polymers. Poly means many as a prefix. Okay? So it's a bunch of stuff shoved together. And that bunch of stuffs that is being shoved together is individually called a monomer. Okay? So mono as a prefix means one unit, a single unit. Okay? And so you get these individual building blocks that come together in various ways to form each of these macromolecules. Okay? So if you hear me here say polymer, I'm talking about the big unit. And when I say monomer, I'm talking about the individual building blocks of each unit. So for instance, I'm going to start with carbohydrates. The polymer, the full carbohydrate, is called a polysaccharide. A polysaccharide. Polysaccharide. Whereas the monomer is called a monosaccharide. And so carbohydrates, in general, as a collective whole, are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And now, there's a couple different forms of carbohydrates. The primary role of carbohydrates for living things en masse is as an energy storage unit. So we have things like sugars, and they're typically rings of carbons, okay, with hydrogen offshoots and some oxygens plugged in there. And each of the bonds between the molecules holds a little bit of energy. So when we have some energy to store, it's stored in these bonds, and then we want to get the energy out, we rip the bonds apart, and we get the energy. Okay. So sugars, things like glucose and fructose that plants make through the process of photosynthesis are carbohydrates. There are other carbohydrates as well. There are structural carbohydrates. So if we look at a plant, if you think about eating a plant, right, it's fibrous, stiff. Right? Those stiff structures are actually made out of carbohydrates. They're very, very long chains of very uniform carbohydrate structures. And they interlink in a way that makes them very stiff. Okay? The number one structural carbohydrate that we see is cellulose. And cellulose is what makes plants tough. These interlocking structures. And so we have a hard time breaking down cellulose, right? You can see this is evident if you eat too much salad or too much corn. Those things are hard for our body to break down because they have a lot of cellulose. So carbohydrates have two functions: energy storage and structure. So, next on the list, we're starting at the bottom and moving up, is lipids. And so lipids, like carbohydrates, are composed entirely of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And because they are composed of the same exact units, they actually serve a very similar function, albeit different. And so lipids are also used for energy storage. Lipids are fats and oils and waxes. And so if you think about what we use fat for as opposed to what we use sugar for, right, fat is long-term energy storage. Lipids are long-term energy storage. Right? You can't use it right away, but it holds more energy than does a sugar or a carbohydrate. So lipids are long chains of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Their monomer is fatty acids, which are the individual chains, And you can branch these individual chains together into these larger lipid structures. And so each of those little bonds holds some energy. Right? So this big old lipid holds a lot of energy. Getting that energy out takes us to do some chemistry, takes a little bit of time, a little bit of processing. Right? So it's not great for right now, but it is great for holding on to that energy for a long time when we have that extra energy. Right? So during quarantine, maybe I ate a little bit too many cookies, right? So you can see it in my chin and my cheekies. Right? I got a little bit extra pudge on me. I stored that energy that I saved up from sitting around on my butt all day, and I now have it in my body. As I use more and more of my energy throughout teaching and working and dancing, right, my body will break down those lipids and get that energy back out. Now, just like carbohydrates were energy and structure, lipids are energy and structure. Lipids have a very, 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 very important role in the structure of all living things. Right? A phospholipid, phospho because it has phosphate in it, lipid, is the base of all of our cells' membranes. Right? And so without lipids, we would be nothing. We'd be just nothing at all. So lipids do not mix with water, and that's very important because we don't want water stuff rushing into our cells. We don't want water stuff rushing out of our cells, right? So we have this barrier of lipids that keep our cells self-contained. Lipids also play other roles like waxes, right? So the wax in our ears are a lipid, also making use of that hydrophobic quality, that is, they don't like water. Right. And so the wax in our ears actually keeps things like bacteria and stuff out of our cavities. Right? We don't want stuff going through our ears into our brain so we die. Right? So the wax helps with that. So lipids, long-term energy storage, some structural stuff. Yeah. Very important, very great, made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So, nucleic acids. Okay. Nucleic acids are DNA, RNA, and ATP. So DNA and RNA are very similar molecules. They form our genetic code. Right? They actually carry the information that programs us for us. ATP is slightly different. Right? It's still a nucleic acid, but its role is very different than genetic coding. It's to move energy throughout our cells so our cells can do work. And so they have structural similarities between this group and this group, but the ATP is slightly different in nature than these two. So I'm going to talk about these two first. So these DNA and RNA nucleic acids. The monomer of any nucleic acid is a nitrogenous base. Okay. And so for DNA, we have 4 nitrogenous bases: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. For RNA, we have 4 nitrogenous bases: adenine, uracil, cytosine, and guanine. Okay. And so the thymine and the uracil change up, whether you're talking about DNA or RNA. Details for a time that's later, but just something to talk about. And so these DNA and RNA molecules are very, very long chains of these nitrogenous bases. And the nitrogenous bases have these very slight variations of ATCG, AUCG, and it allows them to function like an alphabet. And so effectively we have words that code for our characteristics. And the order in which these letters show up determines what specific traits we have. And that's through the process of transcription and translation, which again we will delve into in depth when the time comes. But for now, nucleic acids are these genetic materials. And ATP. So ATP is different in that structurally, instead of just having one phosphate in the sugar phosphate backbone, you have your one nitrogenous base, which is adenine, and then you have 3 phosphates attached to it. And so there's energy in each of the bonds between any molecule, but we're looking at the ones between the phosphates. And if I break off that last phosphate, I release a little bit of energy, and my cells use that little bit of energy to do work. Okay? And that leaves me with an adenine with 2 phosphates stuck on it. I can reload that by putting in a little bit of energy, and now I have my energy storage molecule again. So, nucleic acids, DNA, RNA, ATP. So, at last, we have reached our last topic, proteins. Now, proteins are probably the most complex of these 4 macromolecules. They are built out of the monomer amino acid. Okay. And amino acids have 3 components. You have an amine group, you have a middle group attached to a functional group, and then you have a carboxyl group. And so this is an amino acid. A protein is a very, 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 very long chain of amino acids arranged in a very specific sequence. Now, in living things, we utilize 20 different amino acids. And the proteins can be made out of any order of any amount of these 20 different variations. So these protein structures are very, very, very complex. Okay. And each individual amino acid has its own characteristics. So the functional group of the amino acid, right, controls what the amino acid does. It gives it its function. Oh, crazy. Right? And so if that functional group is negatively charged, that amino acid will have a negative charge, and it will do negative chargey things. Right? If that functional group is polar, that amino acid will do polar things. And so the amino acids each have their own little flavor to them, and what you put in what order determines the overall flavor of the protein. Right? And so when you link up all the amino acids together, you get what's called a polypeptide. Okay? And the main difference between a polypeptide and a finished protein is the folding, right? And so it's not just this one long chain. Right? The protein starts as a chain, but then it folds up in different ways, right, into a big ball. And its folding pattern is based on the characteristics of the amino acids. That is, again, something that we will explore in depth during our transcription and translation unit. A lot of these things show up in the translation and transcription unit between nucleic acids and proteins, because that's what the story is about. Okay. But for now, just know that the proteins made up of all the chumps, right? And they're these big balls of amino acids. Their main purpose is to execute or to do what the DNA coding actually is saying, right? So the DNA is just like a book of instructions, okay? And the protein is the actual product, right? And so if I have a bookshelf, right, the bookshelf is the protein, the instruction booklet to make the bookshelf is the DNA. So proteins float around our body and do stuff. Okay? So there are things like enzymes that break down chemicals in our body. Okay? There are receptors and channels in our cells that allow our cells to do specific things. And so our muscle cells will have different protein receptors than will our cardiac cells. Cardiac's a type of muscle cell, that's a bad example. Our intestinal cells. Okay? So protein is structural in nature. Also enzymatic. Enzymes are super important. Okay? Things that we will explore as they come into place in the units. Okay? So this is supposed to just be an introduction to this thing, these things, this thing, these things, all the thing. Okay? This is an introduction. As we encounter these macromolecules in their rightful place in the story of biology, we'll delve more into depth about their properties, how their form actually impacts their function, what they're doing for us, and how they're able to do that. How do these four things come together to make us a whole living organism? And that's a story that you need to be able to tell by the end of the course, not the beginning, not the end of today, not next week, not next month. By the end of the course, you need to be able to tell how these things work together to make a living thing a living thing. So that's it. Today, I gave you a brief introduction to the elements of life, the elements of which all living things are made out of: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. We looked at their sizes and some of the roles that they play in the macromolecules that make up living things. Okay? So these are the big pieces, these are the tiniest pieces, and it all works together into one big unit to make a living organism. All living things are made out of this stuff right here, at least on this planet. On other planets, there's other possibilities, right? We shouldn't make assumptions. But as we know life, this is what we're made up of. Cool? Great. So, what I'd like you to do is please go over to Schoology, look at the discussion question that is linked to this lecture, answer that in the discussion below, and have yourself a fantastic day. Thank you for coming. I hope you've enjoyed my classroom.
Tell you like it is, it's like this. Don't be such a slave to your brother. Baby, get shaky.